Well, this weekend, of course, is big in the minds of many, many people, maybe not necessarily here in Texas, but many, many people, particularly in the Northeast, because it's Super Bowl weekend. And I think that it's only appropriate that the Super Bowl weekend is between the Philadelphia Eagles and the New England Patriots. It's only fair because the Super Bowl gets to be a New England and Northeastern thing because the South absolutely owned the college national championships and really the entire playoff season when you get right down to it. So they can have their thing, we'll keep ours. Of course, what's going on this weekend is that you have the Philadelphia Eagles, who are the newcomers. I did not know this, had never won a Super Bowl, up against the New England Patriots and their quarterback Tom Brady, who by my reckoning have won 40 or 50 of them in the last several decades. I don't know, I can't remember exactly how many it is. But that's a team that in recent decades has really become a dynasty, and they're one of those teams where love them or hate them, you can't argue with their win record, you can't argue with their success. And to take it back to just another moment, you think about college football, and you think about this most recent national championship with the Alabama Crimson Tide in that game against what some people thought was the way things ought to be. If there are any Ohio State fans in the room, my condolences. But if you get brought into the national championship tournament as a wild card and then you just sweep the thing, it's hard to argue that they didn't belong in that tournament. But as you look at Alabama football, again, love them or hate them, whether you're an SEC person or a Big 12 person, whatever, one of the things you have to respect is the coaching record of Nick Saban. Nick Saban is arguably he's probably the best football coach active right now, and arguably one of the best collegiate football coaches ever. I mean, he led the LSU Tigers to the BCS National Championship in 2003, and then he's got 5 national championships with Alabama. He became the first coach in college football history to win a national championship with 2 different schools since the inception of the AP poll in 1936. Saban and Bear Bryant are the only 2 coaches to win an SEC championship at 2 different schools. And in May 2013, he was inducted into the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. And even prior to his 6th national title win, Saban had been considered by many as the greatest coach in college football history. Now, that is a rare and to my reckoning, especially as a football fan, an awe-inspiring level of success. And again, love him or hate him, you can't argue with the product. You can't argue with the end result. But here's my question for us today. How do you deal with that much success? How do you deal with that much success? I mean, certainly there are a number of athletes and a number of coaches that have achieved and held that level for a long time. I mean, names like Dean Smith and, of course, Bear Bryant, Joe Montana, Michael Jordan, Mike Krzyzewski, Greg Popovich, Jack Nicklaus. There are just a few who have been at that level and have maintained it for quite some time. But unfortunately, I think Nick Saban and those like him, those people that I just named a second ago, they're the exception rather than the rule. Lots of people reach that level of success, but then they also seem to reach a level of excess. They get to that level, but then they can't maintain, and a lot of times it's not just because their athletic ability fails them or because they have an injury or something like that. Sometimes it's just that they can't handle that level of success. I mean, you think about people like Tiger Woods. You think about people like Michael Phelps, who right after winning his 7th, 8th gold medal was busted for marijuana possession at visiting friends at the University of South Carolina, of all places. I mean, Lance Armstrong, who was once not only the poster boy for repeated victory, but also for courage and character, was shown to have won all of his Tour de France titles by basically taking drugs to do it. And then, of course, tragic figures like Joe Paterno, those all come to mind. They reach this level of success, but then there's some huge failing in one way or another. And also, all too often, it seems like success is a paradox. The more successful you are, the more tempting it is to abandon the discipline and the values and the factors that made you successful in the first place. It's easy to be consumed by what the Greeks call hubris, which is kind of pride amplified. And all these things just come together and form this feeling that one becomes untouchable. That's true of both individuals and institutions. Whatever success you may have had, romantic, financial, athletic, academic, political, familial, all too often people discover that when you're standing on top of the world, it's easy to lose your balance. Now, the Bible has lots to say about dealing with loss and failure and fear and defeat, etc., all of those things. But success has its own set of problems. What do you do with success? That was the issue for Abram. Abram had been blessed more than any other man of his age. God had promised to make him the father of a great nation. He promised to give him a prosperous land to call home. And he promised to bless Abram so abundantly that those blessings would spill over to all of the nations of the earth. And in spite of Abraham's fears, in spite of his faults, in spite of his failures, God kept making good on His promises. But in Genesis chapter 14, the Bible tells us that something happened that would challenge Abram's faithfulness and expose his true character, and this time to the good. First, a little bit of review. Remember that as Abram's tribe grew, as his family grew in numbers and in livestock and in prosperity, things started to get a little crowded. Have you ever noticed that as you become more successful, friends, relatives, family, they kind of start to stick around a little bit more. Maybe things start to get a little bit close. Well, that started to happen. And one day, his nephew Lot, and this is what you all talked about last week, one day his nephew Lot came to Abram and said, look, I and my family, we need some elbow room. My herdsmen are quarreling with your herdsmen. A fight could break out any minute. We need some space. And so Abram gave Lot the first choice of where he would like to settle. And when Lot looked at his choices and he saw that the real prize was the Jordan Valley, it was well watered, it was bountiful, Lot chose to make the Jordan Valley his home. It was beautiful. It was that land that every farmer, that every settler wants to have. The only problem is that it was near a major urban center. The name of the city was Sodom. Now, if the name of that place sounds familiar, then you're already understanding why Lot made a bad decision. As Scripture tells us, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. That's bad in biblical terms. You do not want that on your gravestone, on your resume, and you certainly don't want that on your sign coming into town right next to the Lions Club and the Kiwanis Club and all those other things as you're rolling into town. This is Sodom. The men here are wicked, and we are great sinners against the Lord. You don't want that as your Chamber of Commerce slogan, because Sodom was a place of brutality. It was a place of slavery, of gluttony, of greed, and grotesque sexual decadence. Throughout history, the very name has been identified with perversion. But you know what? It was also rich, and the wrong kind of people could make a lot of money there. Now, the Bible tells us that not long after Lot had settled there, a coalition of Mesopotamian raiders, 4 Mesopotamian kings, as the Bible calls them, marched into the Jordan Valley to plunder it and to reassert their control over that region. They swept in like raiders or Vikings or banditos or pirates, just killing and looting and pillaging and raping and adding yet one more blood-stained chapter to the story of man's cruelty. The local chieftains or kings, 5 of them, took their armies to repel them, but then they were routed in the Battle of Siddim, also known as the Battle of 9 Kings. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and what survivors they had left fled into the hills or hid underground. But the invaders took the cities. Well, among those captured, among those pillaged and overrun by these raiders were Lot and his neighbors. They got caught up in this war, and they may have even fought on the side of Sodom and Gomorrah. But when King Chedorlaomer defeated Lot's neighbors, Lot was captured and his people were plundered, and he lost everything. And when Abram got the news, he leapt into action. Abram had 318 of what the Bible calls trained men. This was not just a posse that he gathered. This was not as like, does anybody have a hoe or maybe a rock or a slingshot, and we'll try and go take on this army. No, the Bible designates that he had 318 trained men under his command. They were tough, they were loyal, and they were experienced. And that made, having 318 trained professional soldiers, made Abram something of a minor warlord. Now, we don't know exactly what the Bible means when it calls them trained men, but given what happens next, we can conclude that these guys were like the Jewish Jedi Knights or something. They were like Navy SEALs or Green Berets or Halo jumpers. They were tough, they were trained, they were experienced, and they pursued the Mesopotamian army all the way to the region of Dan. And when they finally caught up with the enemy, Abram split his men and conducted this complex nighttime assault. I mean, this was real, ancient, special ops type of stuff. And even though Abram was outnumbered, he had superior soldiers and knew how to use the element of surprise. And the Bible tells us that his success was total, absolute victory. He routed the army of King Chedorlaomer and chased them all the way back to Damascus. He recaptured Lot and regained everything that Lot had lost, as well as recapturing everything that had been plundered from Sodom and Gomorrah. Treasure, prisoners, livestock, everything. And so think about that. This victory established Abram as someone to be reckoned with. He and his 318 Green Berets had single-handedly defeated the army that had overwhelmed Sodom and Gomorrah and all the other Canaanite kings. He wasn't just some Bedouin chieftain, some wandering nomad. He was a warlord. He was a prince with everything but the title. And even though he wasn't recognized as a king, he was someone to be feared. When Abram returned from the battle, it was pretty clear who was in charge of the Jordan Valley. Now, the Bible tells us in the passage that you all read for today that when Abram returned from the battle, two kings went out to meet him in a place called the King's Valley. One was Bera, the king of Sodom, possibly the only king of the five that survived. The other was a man named Melchizedek. He wasn't part of the coalition, but he was the king of Salem. And here's what happened. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Now here is what we know about this man, this king named Melchizedek. The meaning of the name is King of Righteousness. That is what Melchizedek means. It means King of Righteousness. He was the king of Salem. And Salem is believed to have been the ancient shorthand name for Jerusalem. Jerusalem. And Salem is also, interestingly, a form of the word shalom, which means what? Peace. Exactly. If you remember that Arabic and other Semitic languages are very closely related. If you ever hear a Muslim say, "Salam alaikum," salam means peace. And so here was Melchizedek, who was the king of righteousness, also the king of Salem, which makes him also the king or prince of peace. Now he is identified as a priest of El Elyon, which is one of the many names of Yahweh, one of the many names, one of the sort of the titles attached to the name of the Lord, the name of God. And what it means simply is God Most High. God Most High. We also know that as we look at what Melchizedek did, he brought Abram a gift, an expression of friendship. He brought him bread and wine. And we'll come back to that in a moment. We also see that he blessed Abram, but then he did something else. He gave God all of the credit for the victory. And at this point we might want to ask ourselves a question. I mean, here comes this priest, this king, who comes out to meet Abram after this great battle, and essentially one could receive this as, here's a gift, blessed are you, but you didn't really do this yourself. You're really lucky God was on your side and not the other guy's side, because this was really God's victory, not yours. And, in my own thinking, I kind of wonder, would my pride have stood for that? Would I have been able, my pride's pretty fragile. I got a pretty low threshold for this. And I think that would have tweaked me a little bit. Well, yeah, sure, to God be the glory, but it was really me. I'm the one who really did this. These are my trained men. It was my strategy. But yeah, sure, praise God. Don't we do that sometimes? But that's what Melchizedek said to him. He said, to God be the glory. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Now, Melchizedek is not just some random figure. He's not just a historical footnote of Israel's past, but he is something of a mystery. As John Calvin said, Melchizedek, whoever he was, is presented before us without any origin, as if he had dropped out from the clouds, and his name is buried without any mention of his death. Basically, this is the only time he appears, other than in secondhand or other accounts about him. This is the only time we actually see him, and he comes out of nowhere and he disappears into history, and we have no idea what happens to him. That's what Calvin makes that analysis. He's only mentioned 2 other times in the Bible, one other time in the Old Testament, in Psalm 110, and in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. But that's not the only time he's mentioned in ancient literature. The ancient Jews and the ancient Christians all believed that he was more than just a local prince. Some ancient sources believe him to be an angel of the Lord, an archangel, possibly even Michael. Others say that Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, well, that's just a title, and that the man behind the title had another name. And one of the interesting ancient rabbinical guesses as to his other name is that he is none other than the son of Noah named Shem. If you look at if you think about the biblical, if you think about the book of Genesis and all those genealogies and all those birthday lists and all, we tend to just kind of fly over those. But you've got to think about, if you think about the literary integrity of the book of Genesis, those things are all taken very seriously. And by that reckoning, Shem, the son of Noah, overlapped and outlived Abram by 25 years. And what the ancient rabbis believed that this is one reason why Noah gave Melchizedek immediate respect. He knew who he was. Now, is there any proof for that? Is there any biblical standing for that? No, because this is all we have of Melchizedek. But I thought that's an interesting bit of speculation. It's an interesting bit of trivia. But whatever his origin and identity, Melchizedek was a real person who became a powerful symbol. Throughout Hebrew history, this king of righteousness was understood to be a foreshadowing of the coming of the Messiah. Both Jews and Christians believe that. The Jews do not attach to Jesus that title, but they still attach to Melchizedek this idea that he is a foreshadowing of the Messiah. Calvin again says of Melchizedek, the kingdom and priesthood of Christ was shadowed forth in him. The writer of Hebrews gives us 3 points of comparison between Melchizedek and Jesus. First of all, He was a priesthood, or he was a priest of the kind, established not on the basis of heredity, but of office. In other words, Melchizedek was a priest not simply because his father had been one, but because he was the king of Salem. Similarly, Jesus was not a priest because of heredity. He didn't come from the priestly tribe of Levi, but because he was the Messiah, because he was the king, and because he was from the family and lineage of David, or the son of David. In that sense, Jesus was a priest after the order of, or the type of, Melchizedek, Hebrews 6:20. His was also an eternal priesthood. There's no mention of Melchizedek having any successor. His priestly office, as far as the Bible's concerned, was fulfilled by this one man. There was no group of Melchizedekian priests. For the Levitical priesthood, however, there was a great deal of concern to ensure the succession and the continuation of this line. Sacrifices had to be offered continually, generation after generation, and Levitical priests had the habit of dying like other people, so they had to be replaced. But this was not true of Jesus. He had no successors because his sacrifice was offered once and for all. Furthermore, having been raised from the dead, he has been able to intercede for his people perpetually. He doesn't have to be replaced. He continues to offer prayers before the throne of God on our behalf. Also, Hebrews says that his was a superior priesthood. Abram submitted himself to Melchizedek and gave him a tithe. This was particularly striking since elsewhere Abram acted as the priest for his own family. Normally, he built his own altars and offered his own sacrifices, but here he is recognizing the priesthood of another. On top of that, here he is commanding the most powerful military force in the Jordan Valley. And here comes the king of Salem, and yet Abram still pays him homage, pays him tribute, gives him a tithe, interestingly, not just a tithe of what he gained in the battle, but of his own wealth as well. Everything he had. We'll come back to that in a second. But as we look at Melchizedek, the priesthood, he is superior to the old priesthood because Jesus is superior to the Levitical priesthood. Why do we need that? The reason is that the Old Testament priesthood could never fully deal with sin. The blood of assorted animals was never enough and could never have been enough to pay for our rebellion against an infinitely holy and an infinitely majestic God. The prophet Micah sensed this when he wrote, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" Micah is saying none of that is enough, ultimately, to satisfy our need to reconcile our relationship with God. But on the cross, Jesus Christ died once and for all, the righteous in the place of the unrighteous, the perfect Son of God in the place of sinful creatures. His death, his sacrifice, was sufficient for all time. It didn't need to be repeated time and time again. And thus Abram recognized that here is someone else greater than he, through whom he must approach God. In Melchizedek, he recognizes a forerunner of the great high priest to come, Jesus Christ, who would offer the perfect sacrifice once and for all for him. So the bottom line is this: Melchizedek was a king, but more than that, he was God's man. Now, that's Melchizedek. On the other hand, we have the king of Sodom. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." First words out of his mouth. No thanks, no gratitude, no friendship. Thank you for saving all of us, by the way, while we were up in the caves hiding in holes. None of that. Just give me back my stuff, or really just give me back my people. And it's not really clear what the king of Sodom wanted from Abraham beyond just the literal interpretation of what he says. Was he trying to bribe Abram for protection? Was he afraid of Abram? Was he trying to curry favor with Abram since Abram was now the strongest kid on the block? In marked contrast to Melchizedek's blessing, the king of Sodom's remarks are surly. They're kind of small-minded. He expresses no gratitude, and in a sense, he dishonors Abram by approaching him this way. And we have to remember that in the light of what God said in Genesis 12:3, those who curse you, I will curse. Those who dishonor you, I will dishonor. The king of Sodom was greatly dishonored, we will come to find later. But so there was Abram standing in front of these two kings, standing in front of the man of God and the king of Sodom. And what we have to recognize is that there was something about Melchizedek and the truth that he represented that made Abram humble. Because really, in some ways, Abram's being faced with a choice. He had a choice between submission to this king of righteousness or lordship over the king of Sodom and all that it represented. And the Bible tells us that Abram chose for Melchizedek. It says that Abram gave him a tenth of everything he had. I said that a second ago. Not just the plunder, but everything he had. That means that Abram gave him a tenth of his own wealth, which by this time was an enormous sum. And by paying this tribute to Melchizedek, Abram was saying, you are higher than I am. You are greater than I. I may be the conqueror, but God is the Lord. And then Abram turned to the king of Sodom and he said, I've lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Abram saying, I'm not a mercenary. I don't want your stuff. I don't want your people. I fight for justice, not plunder. I fight for right, not power. Abram had not used Lot's capture as an excuse to become a raider or a conqueror himself. In other words, I will take no credit for this victory. I want the world to know that my success doesn't come from you, king of Sodom, or from me, but it comes from the Lord. I will not compromise or pay tribute to you, and nor will I claim to grow mighty by the strength of my own hand. You see, Abram came back from this rescue mission a rich and powerful man. He didn't have to give anything to Melchizedek. He could have said, it's all mine. I earned it. And he could have cut down the king of Sodom right then and there and claimed everything. He could have had it all. I mean, who could stand against him now? But he didn't. Because even though he could have claimed a crown for himself, he remembered that this land and this victory was only his because God had given it to him. At the moment when Abram could have commanded or demanded or claimed anything and everything, he chose to honor God. Now we have to remember that there is nothing superfluous or extraneous or accidental in the Bible. So why is this story so important? Seems like a kind of a minor story in the grand scheme of things. Well, it's important because we need to learn how to live with both defeat and blessing. We need to learn how to live with blessing and success as well as hardship. Think about this. There's so many connections between Melchizedek and Jesus, more than we have to explore at this time. But Jesus was himself offered an earthly kingdom, was he not? But chose the cross. What happens when we are confronted by Christ, when we face him, and when we face the cross ourselves? You know, all of us are going to have moments, all of us are going to have moments in which we have to decide whether I'm going to make this moment all about me or all about God. I want to inject just a little bit of a personal story here. I want to thank you all for the tremendous encouragement that I have received after John Buchek's funeral on Tuesday. And believe me, I love the encouragement. Matter of fact, I kind of love it too much. It's real easy for a pastor, and I'm not saying all of a sudden don't start kicking me in the shins or anything like that, but it's real easy for a pastor to sit back after a service like that, after a big Easter, after a big Sunday, after a capital campaign or a successful day of offering. It's real easy for a pastor to come up and say, "Man, I'm good. I'm the rainmaker. Check me out. Watch out, Joel Osteen, here I come." And it's hard. Humility is hard. Humility is one of the most difficult things, one of the most difficult challenges that we have. How do I've had lots of practice with dealing with defeat. I know how to handle that. I'm a good loser. But am I a good winner? We all have to face those challenges. And I love your encouragement. I'm not asking you to I receive those encouraging words as praise to God for what He's done. But from the inside of this skull, I realize that this challenge that Abram faced was exactly the one that we all face every day. To choose Melchizedek is to choose God and say, you know what, this is not all about me. This is about God. Even as strong and successful as I am, I need you, and I can't do without you. On the other hand, choosing Sodom is to say, I'm all I need, and I can pretty much do it on my own. Let me ask you that. Every time you've chosen yourself, when you've said, I can do this on my own, I don't need anybody else, much less God, how'd that work out for you? Yeah, not very well. These two real people represent a real choice that Abram and all of us must make. We must choose between the king of righteousness, the king of peace, and the king of pride, the king of Sodom, with all of the connotations and the short-term prizes that implies. The king of Sodom or the king of Salem. Will we choose Sodom or Salem? Will we choose humility or hubris, pride or perversion or peace? Will we go to Sodom, honor ourselves, and have one heck of a YouTube-worthy weekend? Or will we go with Melchizedek, humble ourselves, honor God, and know life abundantly and life eternally? The way this story is told, it leads us to this moment, to this choice. Here's Abram, who has seen God's faithfulness in spite of all his faltering, failures, and fumbling. And yet he still chooses God. I believe that God is testing him here. Not to see if Abram can prove his righteousness, but rather to see if he's learned anything over the last couple of chapters. I think he has. And sometimes I wonder, when God tests us, does he test us so that he will know the results of our test or so that we will? In other words, God knows what Abram's going to do. But he wants Abram to know what Abram is going to do. He wants Abram to be confirmed in his own character. So I believe that God is testing him. And yet Abram must have been tempted to take matters into his own hands. It must have seemed attractive to take a shortcut and seize what God had promised. This promised land now lay at his feet. It looked as if he could seize a large part of it and possess both the people and the land. And Satan must have been whispering to him, as he would later whisper to Jesus, all this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. Here was a test every bit as searching of his faith as when an escapee came to him earlier, desperately seeking his help. Remember when Lot's servant came to him? Then he had to draw his sword against all human wisdom to rescue his undeserving relative Lot. He had to go up against a superior force and trust God. Now he had to sheathe his sword once again against all human wisdom, against all practicality, and wait for God's promise and fulfillment for him to inherit the land. God's time to give him the land had not yet come. And Abram would rather wait for God's time than take it in his time, even if that meant that he might die in the waiting. He would rather wait for God than stretch out his own hand to snatch the forbidden fruit. And in his patient faith, Abram provided a graphic contrast to Adam and Eve, who were so easily convinced to doubt God's word and believe the serpent's lies. One last note. As a gift, Melchizedek brought bread and wine. Now, one way to understand this mention of bread and wine is to understand it as an ancient expression, which we occasionally see, meaning that Melchizedek brought him a full dinner, a feast, a banquet, everything from salad to dessert. He brought him the whole enchilada, if you will. That's one meaning, but I think that given the context and given the depth of other meanings and the understanding we have of this because of the New Testament, we know that this bread and wine meant something else. It has a more forward-looking meaning. Thousands of years later, Jesus would designate these same gifts, bread and wine, as the natural, as the tangible reminders of God's supernatural presence. They are the tangible reminder of God's spiritual presence and communion with us. This Sunday, as we come together to worship, we're going to use real bread and real wine, which in the Presbyterian version is grape juice. But we're going to use real stuff to remind ourselves that God is real. We're going to use natural things to remind us of His true, supernatural, His real presence. We use real bread and a real cup to remind us that God gave His real Son, His real body, His real bread, His real blood, to prove His real love for us. Because sometimes you just need something you can hold in your hand. Sometimes you just need a physical reminder. Melchizedek's gift is a reminder that the Prince of Peace comes to us in moments of greatest need and even greatest temptation to remind us and to remind Abram that we're not alone and that God is with us. So Nick Saban had 6 national titles, but he's not undefeated. He's had his share of losses, and I would argue that one of the reasons he has had so much long-term success is because he learned from those losses. I think that Abram learned from his losses. Have we learned from ours? I'm not saying that we'll never lose again. The Bible, though, doesn't tell us how to build a long-term football dynasty, or for that matter, a profitable business, or a political career, or effective school, or even how to get famous. But it does tell us that the key to long-term spiritual success is to honor God, not just in the hard times, but in the winning seasons as well. You may have had a lot of personal success in your life, but what have you done with it? What are you doing with it? My hope is that all of us will have winning seasons in life, but in the end, winning or losing, I hope that we've all learned how to honor God, because He is worthy, and nothing is more enduring than eternity. So let's pray.